Good afternoon, everyone. Um, my name is Eleojo, Abubakar. I'm a doctoral student, kind of trying to round off the writing of my thesis now at Newcastle University in Geography. And my topic is on the need for word zoning system. So essentially, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the zoning system in Nigeria, especially the words, to see if there are problems and to see how those problems can be solved, especially in the context of spatial analysis, because it's important to note that there are other potential uses of zoning systems aside spatial analysis. So in doing this, I would just talk through the background of my presentation, then the objectives of this presentation. Let us see what the study area is like and how the data has been analyzed, what data I've used, and then discuss my results and then conclude. So as a way of providing a background, just note that in socioeconomic applications, we often make use of aggregated data sets. For confidentiality reasons, for instance, because you don't want the identity of some people to be known. And some data may also be very complex. For instance, data at the individual level could be complex, and it's not always the case that that's the appropriate level of analysis for a particular project. So you just want to get a level of analysis that's appropriate for what you're doing. And in so doing, you also save yourself some computer processing time. But those of us that are into spatial analysis are aware of some of the problems that come with aggregate data. And a lot of the previous speakers in this room have talked about many of them. Especially, they've talked about the modifiable area unit problem, which is associated with gerrymandering. So essentially what that means is, as you change the scale of analysis, the results you get from your analysis would kind of change. And associated with that is the zoning problem. So the way the zones are organized, that's the units of aggregation, the boundaries of those units, the way they're organized. If you change the organization, you also get different results. So, and what that does is the results from analysis may not be very reliable in some instances because they are subject to those changes. Then ecological fallacy, from the analysis of spatial data, you kind of get results and you try to suggest that that's indicative of individuals in those zones, which may not always be the case. And that's particularly a problem if zones are not very homogeneous. Then aggregation-induced errors are kind of what you find, especially when you do accessibility analysis using something like gravity models and the rest. Because, you're going to work with centroids of zones as the points of origin. And so, with different zoning definitions, those centroids are going to change, and that's going to cause differences in the results you get. So essentially, what I'm driving at from this slide is that it's important to be critical of the zones you use for analysis, especially if you're concerned about equity, which means fairness, and especially in low and middle income contexts like Nigeria, where most of the zones are political zones. So I would now kind of look at some of the issues associated with the use of political zones. And in doing this, it's important to point out that in many other countries, especially in the developed world, aggregation units are not political zones, and so they may not suffer as much of the problems discussed here. So you need to have a standard population that is balanced. What that means is that all the zones, the population in those zones are similar. They are homogeneous as well. That's related to the problem of ecological fallacy. They are compact and contiguous. That's related to the issue of accessibility, because the more compact and contiguous, the easier it is to reach places within the zone. And when you have a project, you don't know how many zones are ideal for the work you're trying to do. and that's related to the scale problem. So it's important to point out that standardized zonal populations and balance is very much associated with the issue of so overall, you want to see if the zoning system you're working with is fit for the purpose of your analysis, and as a result, you're going to get stable and reliable results. And if they are fit, I mean, you're sure that whatever maybe intervention derives from those zoning systems will not cause what is called intervention generated inequity, because some interventions do generate inequity. So the objectives of this presentation, like I've tried to say, kind of look critically at the zones and kind of see if they are appropriate for a given purpose. And I should just note that this is part of the pilot study for my PhD work, which is concerned with small area analysis of primary healthcare need and accessibility. So I wanted to check if the existing zones are appropriate for that purpose and what problems they could possibly embody. What are the causes and consequences of those problems? And if there are problems, how do you overcome them? So just provide further context. The study area is a state known as Kogi State. So it's chosen because it's a form of microcosm. So this is the geography of the study area at this level. It's like a microcosm of the full country, because the broad tensions and dynamics that operate at the large scale also manifest themselves at the smaller scale. So you have ethno-religious tensions associated with resource distribution, political power, political representation, and those kind of things. So this is what the zoning system in Nigeria looks like. So I'm kind of interrogating zones at this level, which according to are expected to have 10,000 to 20,000 people, but who will soon see this is not usually the case. So in the course of my presentation, I'll talk of local government areas as well. So this is a higher level. I would also mention states, and you'll hear me talk about geopolitical zones. Essentially, there are 6 geopolitical zones in Nigeria, which all of these color kind of illustrate. So by way of data, the main data that was used for this work is the 1 kilometer square gridded demographic data set from the World Pop project, which is arguably some of the finest data you could get on demography. And from that data, I did use population data, which is age sex aggregated data. So you have age groups and for each sex. Then you have poverty data, what percentage of people in each pixel live below $1.25. Then contraceptive use, modern contraceptive use of women. What ratio of women use modern contraceptives? Then literacy by males and females. How many males and females are literate? Then the same with stunting. So the idea of combining all of this data, population tells the number of people in a small area, and the other variables tell you how homogeneous it is and their relevance for health study. Then the software is a tool software, which is kind of popular and indeed was kind of used to develop most of the statistical data aggregation units in the UK, designed by Professor Dave Martins and Samantha Calkins in Southampton. So it's a very robust software that has and reasonably user-friendly as well. And so the steps I followed are the standard steps. The first thing is you have to design building block areas, which are the basic units that get aggregated. So you design them and you provide attributes for them as well. Then you kind of specify hard zoning constraints, which are like minimum and maximum population thresholds, and should they be nested within larger zones and those kind of things. Then you have soft constraints, which define what attributes should be traded off, and that's related to equity, how balanced should the population be, how homogeneous, and how compact. So happens that when you try to achieve one aspect of the soft constraints, it happens at the expense of the others. We shall soon see. So the workflow for the analysis is what you have up here. I would spare you that detail for now, but essentially you kind of have all of these attributes, and you go on to kind of put them into the algorithm and get your results. So this is what the interface for the algorithm looks like. If you look here, you would find most of those attributes included there, and we'll soon take a look at what the results are like. So it's important at this stage to kind of mention that the key motivation for this work is, first, at the world level geography in Nigeria, you don't have mappable demarcations. So it's even almost impossible to run spatial analysis at that level, especially for the whole country. That's as at 2007 when this work was conceived. So at that time, we only had world geographies for 3 local government areas, which are Kababunu, here, Dekina, and Ibaji. So I kind of used these 3 local government areas to test the idea of this project. And so what we found was that for Dekina, you had 2 words, 10 words; for Ibaji, 14 words. Because, I mean, the 3 local government areas have 36 words altogether. That's what they have. And when you kind of created optimized words, you discover that Dekina got allocated 17, Ibaji 9, and then Kaba 10. So what that means is currently Dekina tends to have less word than it ought to have. Ibaji has, I mean, 1 more word is supposed to have fewer words, and Kaba, I mean, benefits the most from the system. So overall, I'm kind of suggesting that the current system is suboptimal and is inequitable, and there are far-reaching effects of that, which I will talk about later. But you kind of have the maps of these zoning systems here. So what I did was to optimize for 2 criteria. In the first one, I tried to optimize for population balance, and in the second one, I kind of optimized for shape compactness, and you could see results would kind of change as you do that. So we'll take a closer look at the results, and I've kind of explained the number of words you get. So this is what the current situation is like. So this one optimizes for population balance, and you could see that compared with what you have here, you can see that the minimum and maximum population are very much similar for all the words. So the words have almost the same population, which is very good in terms of equity. And when we now look at compactness, the allocation of words to local governments have still remained the same. And the population have kind of changed a little. Looking at the standard deviation, you see that when population balance was optimized, you get a better standard deviation. I mean, the lower the value, the better in terms of population balance. But when you now optimize for shape compactness, while the compactness mean improves by kind of reducing, the lower this value is, the more compact. You can now see that the standard deviation has kind of increased, which shows that population balance would reduce if compactness increases. So there's always this threshold, I mean, this trade-off, because they're soft attributes. So I now kind of look at the implications of this result briefly in terms of policy analysis. The first thing that's worth noting is that the current zoning systems they are kind of inequitable, because they fall short of standard zone design criteria, like I have shown. And because of that, there's a tendency for the zoning system to perpetuate inequity in public service provision. And one good example, for instance, is the current policy of the Nigerian government is to provide primary healthcare, 1 primary healthcare facility per ward. So what that means is, if you now have 14 wards instead of maybe 10, like I did show here, it means by this policy, I mean, you're going to get like 4 more words than you ordinarily are supposed to have. And the keynote, for instance, is going to get 5 facilities less than it's ordinarily supposed to have. So you come to appreciate the ramification of this problem. And it also affects political power and representation, because a lot of portfolios, are allocated based on number of words and things like that. So to mitigate this problem, I suggest that optimized analytical words. That means words are created for the purpose of spatial analysis. That means we should kind of not rely so much on the political words, because in essence, political words are for political purposes. And so using them for other purposes for which they are not meant for kinds of perpetuates the problems in those words. And to further problematize the situation, I kind of made the point that existing words were created by totalitarian military regimes. And those military regimes were kind of led and dominated by hegemonic ethno-religious and or geopolitical groups. And because of that, you know what the military is all about, command and control. So they just kind of provided zones as to favor their own interests. So these problems are historical and they are political. And relying on those zones means perpetuating problems that have a long history and are political. So special analysts should kind of try to avoid those zones. And the problem has a far-reaching dimension, because the design of sampling procedures for most national and international surveys, like the demographic and health survey and the multiple indicator cluster survey, which are used to evaluate sustainable development goals and indicators, are kind of based on those zones, because there is what is called weighting adjustment, which tries to correct for differences in the population of zones in terms of the sampling. But while I'm aware that that would kind of solve problems in terms of natural zones, like age groups, gender, and the rest, that do not change. Their natural household size and family size. But existing, weighting adjustments will not solve zoning problems, because as you change the configuration and the size of the zones, the weights are going to change, and by implication, the results you get from those surveys are going to change. So surveys that have used extant zones for their sampling procedure, in my opinion, from what I've found, are misrepresentational and are misleading, and to an extent, the likelihood would be kind of entrenching extant inequalities in Nigeria, to the disadvantage of underrepresented groups at the time the extant zones were created. So by way of conclusion, I'm suggesting that for spatial analysis and other uses that are not political, optimized analytical zones should be created, and overall political zones themselves should be reviewed. And there are well-established criteria for reviewing political zones beyond even that considered in this project, and that falls under the problem of political districting problems. And automated zone design methods should be used for that. And when you look at political zones themselves, they are not supposed to be static. They are supposed to be revised. What we have in Nigeria has been created for more than 20 to 30 years. They are not being revised, and revision is necessitated by continuous changes in population dynamics in terms of changes in birth rate, mortality rate, and migration. So as these things happen, and socioeconomic status as well, you need to revise the zoning system. And the last point I think I tried to make is that data aggregation zones should, like I've said before, be disentangled from political districts in Nigeria, because while we need to kind of review existing zones, that may be difficult, because the same hegemonic groups hold, they are still powerful, and they occupy very powerful positions in political space, and so they're likely to resist attempts at this revision, and this kind of revision is going to be played with all sorts of political tension. So that's likely going to take some time and a lot of effort. So in the meantime, spatial analysis should not use so much of those political districts. Other sample surveys and strategies and interventions should not rely on those political districts so that you don't perpetuate the problems in those districts, and rather you create optimized analytical zones for your purpose, and which could maybe be later aggregated to existing zones. But in that case, it's not likely going to perpetuate existing problems, in my own opinion. So a bunch of references, and I think this brings my presentation to a close. Thank you so much for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions that may arise. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Eleojo, for a great presentation. Please, the audience, withhold the applauses so that we can track the questions for Eleojo. Yeah, so thinking about your last slide,
Yeah.
Obviously zoning is a highly political issue, and you say, I think correctly, that particular groups will resist change. And do you have examples of comparable countries that have successfully overcome these problems and created, for example, an independent zoning body, or the kind of approach that would guarantee, to some extent, impartiality in the zoning?
Well, I have not really looked at what many other countries do, but I do know, for instance, like in the UK, you do have output areas, super output areas, middle output areas, low output areas, which, in my opinion, are not political zones, but kind of statistical data collection and spatial analysis zones. You see what I mean? So I do feel that quite a number of developed countries have, maybe even if they use political zones, for instance, those zones have been kind of optimized to ensure equity. I don't know that the zones in Canada are optimized, the zones in the US are optimized every 10 years after population census, and the zones in Australia are optimized. I mean, they are revised after every five years. So I think that answers the question a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. Thanks. Let's see if somebody has questions. Yeah, another question is about the optimality of the number of zones, and I was wondering if you can expand a bit on how you determine whether a zoning is optimal or not.
Okay, that's a great question. So to expand on that, what I try to do is kind of look at the number of existing zones to start with. And so for the 3 local government areas considered, we'll have, I think, 36 zones, which is what you kind of have here. You have 36 zones here. And so with these, you kind of have the population, for instance, of the study area. And with that population, it's just the case that if you divide the population of the study area by 36, you're going to have something like 21,315. So the idea is to tell the algorithm that's the AZ tool that if you want to have a zoning system whose optimal population is 21,315, and who meets all of these criteria, because you can see the maximum population threshold, minimum target population tolerance, and all of these, who meets all of these criteria, what would that zoning output be like? So the software does that work internally in trying to optimize to meet all of these criteria. So for this pilot work, um, like I did say, we kind of optimized majorly for the target population with the hope that that provides the total number of zones and allocates that to different local government areas. So it does the work internally in terms of trading off the soft criteria, and the hard criteria were kind of specified but not shown here because it goes ahead to meet them. And it's expected, like I did show in this slide, that you kind of have this total replicated in all the optimal outputs. And like you can see from, let's say, the standard deviation, for instance, while the existing zones have very large standard deviation, optimized zones, you just have 80, 44, and 87, where we used to have maybe for about like about 13,000 and things like that. For instance, if you take a look at this local government called Dekina, the smallest ward has 10,612 people currently by the data, and the biggest ward in that local government has 68,000 thereabout, which is like 5 times. But if you kind of look at what you have for the optimized version, you can see that the Kina would have a minimum. I mean, the smallest word here will have a minimum of 21 and a maximum of 21,000, which is about the same. And the same thing happens to all the other words, including the entire study area. So you can see that it goes a long way to achieve that result of optimality. Optimality is a measure of how well the zoning system meets the standard criteria I did outline at the start. I don't know if this answers the
No,
question.
it's very clear. No, it's great. Thanks. We have a couple more questions from the audience. One is Puri. An interesting and important analysis. Would natural or social boundaries be more appropriate for replacing the current situation? So the question is natural or social boundaries.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. The zoning system actually recognizes natural boundaries, for instance, because in the larger, I mean, the real analysis for this one, because this is just a pilot aspect, you will see that we have you have, this is the study area, and you have two major rivers. So one of the criteria, which is a hard criteria, is that a zoning system should not overlap this river, because I mean it's likely the case that would lead to some form of a discontiguity. So I mean the algorithm is able to respect this kind of natural barrier, and if possible, if there are major roads you don't want the unit zones to overlap those major roads, you could actually specify that in the zoning algorithm. And it's also possible if you have maybe data that represent the social boundaries, for instance. And you may kind of think of social boundaries as maybe ethnic groups that could be further broken down into smaller units. So you could have those ethnic groups and have a geography for them, and kind of have the algorithm respect those higher geographies, so it doesn't kind of mix up different ethnic groups in the same unit of aggregation. So surely it's possible to kind of respect both social boundaries and natural boundaries. But what that does is the more of those hard criteria you try to incorporate, the less optimal the soft constraints will be. So that's just important to take note. And that's why I did mention political districting problems, because that accounts for many of these kind of things. So surely it does account for that.
Yeah, no, that's a very clear answer. Thank you. And definitely it's an area where the more criteria you embed, the less likely the success of the zoning will be. So there's a last question in the last couple of minutes by Paul Esner. You mentioned that aggregation zones should be disentangled from political districts. Can you expand on this further? And how do you think that this proposal will be viewed by the local national administration in Nigeria?
Okay, thank you for that for that great question. Um, by disentangling analytical zones from political um, zones, what I mean is when you have a problem, you the analyst should try to create customized zones that are kind of appropriate for the particular study at hand, and not rely on political zones, because from the findings of this study, I mean, they are inequitable and they are going to perpetuate inequities. And this study I've used what pop greater demographic data. There are other sources of demographic data, so it may be helpful to kind of from all those other sources create customized zones. I'm talking about how well the government would accept the findings from this kind of work. I did mention here that there's going to be some resistance from them, especially because they are the dominant groups, and also because there isn't so much awareness about the extent to which these problems affect certain aspects of national life. So it's part of the goal of this research to kind of increase the awareness of this problem. And it's my hope that if people become a lot more aware of these, then necessary mechanisms in form of agitations and the rest will be in place to kind of maybe look towards solving them in the near future. But in the meantime, we'll create analytical zones instead.